Can a war be just if lots of civilians die? Oxford University's Nigel Biggar writes about this in the magazine this week. In war, civilian suffering can be moral and legal, he says. Nigel joins me now. Nigel Biggar, welcome to Spectator TV. Now, for anyone watching the war unfold in Gaza, I think they would be horrified by the scale of the civilian destruction. But you write in the magazine this week that its horrific scale doesn't tell us anything about its morality or its legality. Tell us about that.
No, you're quite right. The scale of human suffering in Gaza is awful. But the fact is that war involves a lot of tragic human suffering. The laws of war do not prohibit the killing of lots of civilians. The laws of war prohibit the intentional killing of civilians and the disproportionate killing. That's to say, killing that is not necessary to achieve an important military objective. And the reason that the laws of war are permissive in that way is because you can't fight a war successfully without risking civilian casualties often, and certainly during the Second World War the Allies caused grievous harm to civilians, not because they wanted it, not because they intended it, but because there was no other way of fighting the Nazis effectively.
So you're saying if you think that war needs to happen, then civilians sometimes need to die?
I'm afraid so. Not in every case, but usually that is the case. I mean, if you're a pacifist, then of course no casualties, military or non-military, are acceptable morally. If you're not a pacifist, then you're going to have to accept there will be a lot of tragic deaths.
And the World War II example is really interesting. I didn't realise until reading your piece just how much civilian lives were lost. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so most people in the West, certainly in the English-speaking West, think that the war to defeat genocidal Nazism in Europe was morally justified. But a conservative estimate has it that Allied, that's to say British and American bombers killed around 350,000 German civilians. Now that's controversial, of course, because the British, particularly under bomber Harris, may have deliberately intended to kill German civilians, which was immoral. But they didn't intend to kill 70,000 French civilians, which is what happened in France during the Second World War and during the crucial Normandy campaign, the invasion of Normandy in 1944. Around 30,000 French civilians were killed. Why was that? Because the Allies depended very heavily on the use of bombers and artillery, and they didn't have the precise technology that allowed them to target precisely. They didn't want to kill civilians, but they couldn't avoid it. The alternative was to expose troops on the ground to greater risks. The problem was that as early as 1943 the British were running out of men. So it was felt that the priority is to defeat Nazism, and we have to take risks with civilians.
But that's the moral grey area, isn't it? I mean, I can see why intention is very important, but isn't there also a point about negligence? You know, are you, as an army, doing all that you can to minimise civilian casualties, or are you valuing your own soldiers' lives more than that of civilians? And where does that ratio start to become very questionable?
Well, I mean, one has to put it to the likes of the Israeli Defence Force in Gaza. Are you really being as careful with civilian lives as you possibly can? That's a fair question to put. The answer has to come in terms of the circumstances. There's no, as it were, general rule here. The question is, what is it you're trying to achieve militarily? What means are you using? Could you use means that would expose civilians to fewer risks? Is this military objective really important? But depending on the answer could be we can't minimise civilians any further, and we have to pursue this military objective even at the cost of considerable civilian casualties.
I think it's fair to say that the world is watching this conflict. You know, so many countries in the developing world are very concerned about this, and that's why South Africa has recently brought a genocide case against Israel. Yes. But they're raising this kind of questions, aren't they? We can't just take the IDF's word for saying that they're minimising things. What happened on October 7th was so deeply traumatic for them. There has to be questions raised by impartial people outside of Israel.
No, absolutely. But in order for a criticism of Israel to be cogent, in order to make the case that Israel has intentionally targeted civilians, in order to make the case that the exposure of civilians to harm has been disproportionate or genocidal, you need to have military experts who understand military operations. You also need to have people who know the facts on the ground. But granted military expertise and granted knowledge of what's going on the ground, yes, questions need to be put to Israel, as to any country that is waging war. But as for genocide, I mean, you're right. South Africa has brought a case of genocide against Israel in the International Criminal Court. But I think it will fail because the 1948 Genocide Convention stipulates that genocide takes place when there is an intention to destroy a people in whole or in part as such, right? So the idea has to be that Israel wants to exterminate Palestinians, not that Israel is risking Palestinian civilians in the course of pursuing military objectives against Hamas. And if there is evidence of genocidal intent, then let's see it. I don't know there is any such evidence.
And Nigel, what about a duty to find non-military solutions? You know, obviously Israel was thrown into this conflict by the attack of October 7th, but can we really say that Israel has exhausted all non-military options to solve the Palestinian problem before October 7th? And doesn't that have implications on how just this war is?
No, that's a really important point, Cindy. So I think Israel is justified in its immediate military reaction to October 7. Israel has to defend its people against indiscriminately murderous violence. But in the long term, Israel's military operations have to be part of a larger strategy for peace. And I don't know what that is. About 10 years ago, there was a film released called The Gatekeepers. It was actually quite riveting, although it only comprised talking heads, but the talking heads were of grizzled Israeli security, senior security chiefs. And one after another they said, you know, we're in the business of preempting terroristic violence and stamping on fires, and we can keep on doing that till the cows come home, but what's the strategy? Yeah. And they said there is none. This was 10 years ago. And my sense is Israel doesn't have a strategy for peace other than simply containing Hamas and Gaza and undermining the Palestinian Authority. So whereas I think the short-term military action of Israel is justified, the question of prolonged military operations purporting to achieve a final permanent solution to the problem, that has to be part of a larger strategy which involves non-military means, and I think Israel needs to be asked what that strategy is.
Well, the thing that reminded me of was Israeli President Isaac Herzog said last year. He said that there were no such thing as innocent civilians in Gaza, that it's entirely a nation out there that is responsible. I mean, that's the kind of thing that would demonstrate that at least the civilian militant distinction is not drawn by Israel in the same way that maybe international observers are drawing it.
Well, I mean, to some extent, the president is correct in that, particularly in the case of an insurgency such as Hamas's recent operations are, precisely because insurgents hide themselves or mix themselves up with civilians. It's very hard to distinguish. Nevertheless, notwithstanding that, it's still the case that Israel needs to focus on destroying Hamas or disabling Hamas and not exterminating Palestinian people. So I think that distinction still needs to be made. Whatever, it's very hard to judge to what extent this civilian or that civilian is involved militarily with Hamas. Some will be, some will not be. You certainly can't say that all Palestinians are colluding in Hamas's warfare.
Well, Nigel, I think this is, the crux of the issue here. I mean, it's such a horrific conflict and nobody wants to see the destruction, but this is absolutely the crux of the moral issue. So thank you so much for joining Spectator TV.
Thanks for having me on.